In this example, let's try to explain the costs of taxation. Initially, let's assume that there's no tax and we're using the airplane tickets, the airline markets. And when there's no tax initially, each ticket is sold at the equilibrium price, which is $200. $200. This is the market equilibrium, and 100 tickets are bought and sold. This is the equilibrium quantity here. And as we know, consumer surplus is the difference between the buyer's willingness to pay and the price they actually pay. So the actual price is $200. The market determines that price through the interactions of buyers and sellers. But on the demand curve, we have different buyers. We have the buyer's willingness to pay. For example, at $400, there are no buyers. No tickets are sold. When the price is lower, let's say $350, 25 tickets are sold. That means buyers are entering the market and buying those tickets. And as the price goes down again to $300, more buyers will enter the market and purchase more tickets. At $300, 50 tickets are sold. And at lower prices, let's say $250, 75 tickets are sold. And as the price goes down, more buyers will participate in this market. They will buy more tickets until we reach the equilibrium. So, although each point on the demand curve represents the buyer's willingness to pay, right? So these buyers are willing to pay $350, but actually they're paying $200, right? So these buyers have a gain from this participating in this market. Again, we have some other buyers here willing to pay $300. This is the additional buyers' willingness to pay, and actually they're paying $200. They're paying the market price. So they have a gain from participating in this market. And as you see here on the demand curve, each point represents some buyer's willingness to pay. And up to this equilibrium point, E, each buyer will have a consumer surplus, right? So if we add up all these consumer surpluses, we'll get the total consumer surplus, and which is basically the difference between the willingness to pay for each buyer and the actual price that they pay, which is $200. So of course we can calculate that. So we have so many buyers, right? So many buyers. The easiest way to calculate the consumer surplus here would be the area of this triangle. So this consumer surplus is basically the area of this area. So let me put that consumer surplus. Okay, all this area, and let's calculate that. So we have 200 here, and we have 100 on the side. Since this is a triangle, the area would be 100 times 100, $10,000. Okay, now let's do the same thing for producer surplus now. Without tax, we know that the price for the producers sellers receive will be $200. That is the equilibrium price. And on the supply curve, what we have is the seller's willingness to sell. That is determined by the cost of their production. So, for example, when the price is zero, of course, there's no seller, right? But when the price goes up to $50, some sellers will enter the market because they can cover their costs at this $50. Let's say 25 tickets are sold. And as the price goes up at higher prices, more sellers will enter the market, those sellers with higher costs, because now they can cover their costs. As the price goes up to 150 and 200, we'll have additional sellers entering the market, participating in the market. And that happens until we reach the equilibrium point. And at $200, 100 tickets are sold. So what is producer surplus? When we look at these sellers here, these sellers' cost is $50, but actually they are selling the ticket at $200. So these sellers will have a gain. It's not profit. We're not talking about profit. This is the seller's gain from participating in this market. So what is producer surplus? Producer surplus is the price that the seller actually receives minus the cost of the seller. So let's take a look at these sellers' producer surplus. Let's say the cost of production for the additional sellers here is $100. And actually, they're selling at $200. Again, these sellers will have a producer surplus. Each seller will have a positive producer surplus up to this equilibrium point. And after that, of course, the seller's cost will be higher than the ticket price, the market ticket price, $200. So those sellers will not participate in the market. And similarly, these buyers will not participate because they don't value the tickets as much. They value the tickets less than $200. So they're not willing to pay $200. Going back to producer surplus, let's calculate it. Basically, there are so many sellers here. And basically, the producer surplus is price minus cost for all the sellers in the market, which is the area of this red triangle. So once again, we have 200 here, and we have 100 on the side, 100, and let's calculate that. 200 times 100, and this is a triangle, so we divide by 2, and again we have $10,000 for producer surplus. Now, let's assume that there is a $100 tax per ticket in the same market, in the airline market. We know that a tax will create a wedge between supply and demand. So I need to find that $100 distance between supply and demand. And I can see that this distance, let me first, okay, this is $100 between 150 and 250. Okay, so this is the tax amount, and with that we know that the price that the buyers pay and the price that the sellers receive will change. We know that the price that the buyers pay will be $250 after this tax. Since $100 will go to the government, the price that the sellers receive will be $150. Okay, so how many tickets will be bought and sold? It's going to be 75. As we see here now, the consumer surplus and producer surplus shrunk with this tax because now the cost for the buyers increased to $250. So those buyers who are willing to pay $200, they will leave the market. So these buyers will leave the market. So only these buyers. So let's put that here. Let me use another. Okay, only these buyers will enter the market because they're willing to pay $250 and higher. And the other buyers who are willing to pay less than $250, they will leave the market. Similarly, the sellers whose costs are less than $150, they will sell the airplane tickets. But those sellers with higher costs than cost higher than $150, they will leave. They will leave the market. So this trade between the buyers and the sellers will not happen because of this tax. And of course, let's first calculate our consumer surplus and producer surplus. And in this case, I'm not going to do the math. You can do that. It's easy math. So I'm just going to show the areas for consumer surplus and producer surplus. Once again, what is consumer surplus? It is the difference between the buyer's willingness to pay and the price they actually pay. Now, the price they actually pay is $250, and we have all the buyers participating in the market, these buyers. So consumer surplus will shrink to this area. And producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between the price that the sellers receive and the seller's cost. Okay, now we have the price that the sellers receive, and the seller's cost is on the supply curve, of course. Okay, and the area, the producer surplus area, will also shrink. So what happens to this rectangle here? So let's put that. This $100 per ticket tax will go to the government, and 75 tickets are sold. What is the total amount of tax? It's this area. This amount of tax will go to the government as tax revenue. So let's put that here. Tax revenue will be the tax amount times quantity, and that's going to be 100 times 75. $7,500 will go to the government as tax revenue. What is deadweight loss? Remember, initially at the market equilibrium, it's right here, at the market equilibrium, 100 tickets were sold at $200. That was the market price. But now, because of the tax, fewer tickets are sold. So what's happening here with this tax, the trade between these buyers and these buyers are prevented. So 75 tickets are sold, but 25 tickets are not sold because of this tax. And we lose some of the consumer surplus, and again, we lose some of the producer surplus because this trade does not happen between buyers and sellers. We end up with a loss. This is a loss to the society, and we call it deadweight loss. So this deadweight loss is the black triangle, and you can calculate it, of course. I'm not going to do that here. Please, you have the numbers. Please try to calculate it. Now let's try this one. Suppose the government imposes a tax of P3, P1. Let's first show that tax amount. P3, P1 is the tax per unit, and that creates a wedge between supply and demand. What is the equilibrium price before the tax is imposed? That would be that's easy, right? So this is our equilibrium, and the equilibrium price would be P2. The price that buyers effectively pay after the tax is imposed, we know the tax will change the price that the buyers pay and the price that the sellers receive. And after tax, buyers will pay P3 and sellers will effectively receive P1 price. This is the price that the sellers receive. Is the tax imposed on the buyers or on the sellers? Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We don't know, but it doesn't matter. In any case, the price that the buyers pay will be P3. The price that the sellers receive will be P1. And we explained that in the examples. If the tax is on the seller, that will shift the supply curve to the left because it will increase the cost of production if it's on the seller. So an increase in the cost of production will decrease the supply. That is a leftward shift. So here we have this new supply curve, let's say S2, and the new equilibrium will settle at, let's say, E2. So let's mark the initial equilibrium as E1. So at the new equilibrium after this shift in supply, here's the price that the buyers pay. And we know that P3, P1 amount will go to the government as tax revenue, and the sellers will receive P1. If this tax was on the buyers, that would increase the cost to the buyers, so the demand curve will shift to the left. And with that leftward shift, the equilibrium would change to, let's say, E3. And at this new equilibrium, the sellers would receive this P1 price. And how much would the buyers pay? This P1 price, the new equilibrium P1 price, plus the tax amount, this distance here, effectively, the buyers would pay P3 price. So as we see here, it doesn't matter if the tax is on the buyer or on the seller, the effects are the same, the results are the same. We always have the price that the buyers pay above and the price that the sellers receive at below. Okay, now let's try this one. Consumer surplus before the tax was levied is represented by area. We know without tax, we have the market equilibrium and the price would be the equilibrium price P2. So the consumer surplus would be the area between P2 price and the demand curve. So I have A, B, C area for the consumer surplus without tax. Producer surplus before tax would be DHF. Because that is basically the difference between the price, the equilibrium price, and the supply curve. After tax is levied, consumer surplus will change, it will shrink, because after tax is levied, the price that the buyers pay becomes P3, and the consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price that the buyers pay, so the area will be A. After the tax is levied, producer surplus would be just F, because now the sellers will receive P1 price, and producer surplus is the area between the price that the sellers receive and the supply curve. Tax revenue for the government. We know that this tax goes to the government. This is the tax amount per unit. And Q2 quantity is bought and sold. So the total tax revenue for the government would be B and D areas. B, D. Total surplus with the tax. Total surplus with the tax will be consumer surplus, producer surplus, and also the tax revenue, because this surplus is going to the government. It's part of the total surplus. The total surplus would be A, B, D, F. And the total welfare, the loss in total welfare that results from the tax would be C and H, because without tax, Q1 quantity is produced. Tax will lower the quantity bought and sold, and the quantity bought and sold decreases to Q2. That prevents this trade between these buyers and these sellers. This will not happen anymore, and consumers will lose from their consumer surplus. This will be lost, and producer surplus will also lose from their producer surpluses. So this area will be lost, and it will not go to anyone. It will not go to the consumers. It will not go to the producers. It will not go to the government. This is a loss to the society. We call it the loss in welfare, and that is represented by this area C and H.